A lot of threads there, and a minute ago you talked about the writer's voice and the pleasures of that. Everybody has said what a wonderful discovery is the voice in Ned Kelly, the authenticity of that voice. And yet at other times in other books you've talked about the trouble of finding the voice, for instance, Oscar and Lucinda, the voice of the narrator.
Yes, that's absolutely true, but you know what, I don't think that's to do with voice. It's more to do with the fact that the character of the narrator in Oscar and Lucinda and the story of the narrator in Oscar and Lucinda got in the way. The story of the narrator it became clear to me, was not the point. But ultimately the voice of Oscar and Lucinda is the voice of the narrator. This is the person telling the story. And the weird thing about voices is that I've really rarely thought very much about them at all, and that they really are arrived at. Of all the things one frets and worries about, voice seems to be something I find relatively quickly. I mean, I've talked at boring length about how one gets to, like I get to think that I can write in Ned Kelly's voice. But it's quite, and there were some technical problems, and then where you leave out the commas and so on. But voice, I think voice has always been the most intuitive and the least of my problems. And believe me, I can bore you for hours about all the problems, but the voice, not really.
Yes, well, I just found it interesting that in the new book, on the first page, we come across such an utterly different voice. It's the voice of a young woman, Sarah. She's upper class English. She's rather snobby. She says things
I wouldn't
like,
say snobby.
Well, she's of that favour and favour world.
The middle class are snobby. The ruling class are never snobby. You know that. Yes.
She says, London being London.
Well, that's and the funny thing about my life as a fake is that actually I began to write it, and this is about voice too. I began to write it in the voice of the fake himself. And I began writing for the voice. This is the narration of him being born at the age of 24, coming to life in the backyard, in a shed, not knowing anything, and there was Macaulay and Stewart in the house, and so on. And this is how I began, and I spent, I don't know how long, quite a long 6 months, 8 months, trying to make this work. It's got a lot that's attractive about it. I mean, his sheer rage was wonderful, and dealing with the problems of not, what do you know, what do you not know, what do you figure out, what's somehow or other being, what have the muses given you that you know and what you don't know. In the end, and I gave it up because I couldn't make it work, and I had this horrible day, and I've never had a day in my life quite like it in terms of the level of sheer sort of depression, not depression, but just sort of sense of failure and desperation all at once. And because I knew this wasn't going to work, I'd already been working, how could I make this damn story work? And by the end of the day, I'd arrived at this totally new way of telling it, which suddenly there was Kuala Lumpur, and here was the person, the faker, the hoaxer, Christopher Chubb, the person who's invented it, who is seen in a Chinese shop house in Kuala Lumpur, an old man with tropical ulcers on his leg and wearing a sarong and obviously not well cared for, and is seen by this woman who's the primary narrator, or one of many narrators, but the first one, seen by him, and he's reading Rilke. Or if not, then a little bit later.
And she's in the company of John at Slater at that point, isn't he? Who's
well, yeah, she soon, and it turns out that Slater knows this, and the whole story of the hoax comes through. But I wrote it that by the end of the day, and by the end of the day, and all of this is totally intuitive. I mean, I once, years and years ago, remember, and actually, to tell you the truth, I'll probably end up saying it's always a town in Malaysia, but it might have been in Indonesia. And I do remember walking along and looking into this shop house and seeing this old white man who was maybe, had been a soldier, who'd married into this family, or who knows what, and thinking to myself, and this would have been about 1970, thinking, how did he get there? Who is he? What's his story? And so in this day of desperation, this memory comes into it, and because it's got to be about poetry, then the person's the editor of a poetry magazine. And of course, it's a really, the whole thing of writing, as I said, there are lots of voices. So she's not the only voice, but she's the first voice. And one feels a certain insecurity as an Aussie writing in this sort of posh voice. But I have a really dear friend, the wife of the novelist Patrick McGrath, the actress Mariah Aitken, who is, grew up posh. And she's very literary and very smart. And at the end, my biggest fear, my biggest test, was to give Mariah the book to read. And I sort of passed that test. But there was a little thing that she gave me which was really, really wonderful. And early on, I'd written something when Unity Mitford was at the height of her fame. And so she'd given me the praise. And I said, well, what did you think of that? And she said, well, darling, of course, Unity Mitford was at the height of her fame when she tried to shoot herself, when she shot herself in the head. Well, thank you, Mariah. And so we talked about it a little bit, and she said, well, my mother really disliked Unity Mitford because Unity Mitford used to write on letterhead that she'd stolen from Buckingham Palace. And she used to go to balls and things with a ferret in her handbag. And she said, put that in, darling, no one else will know. or those that do will know that you really know. So it was this lovely, lovely gift. So at the very beginning, in the very first, at that stage, when